Bonner's boots crunched against the frozen dirt, each step echoing in the desolate silence of the alien planet. His mission was simple: scout the area, gather intel on enemy movements, and report back to the command center. But as the winds howled through the ruins of what once might have been a thriving city, Bonner felt a deep unease settle in his gut. The planet felt empty, as though life had been drained from it, leaving only echoes behind. His breath fogged in the cold, a constant reminder of the harsh environment around him. As he trudged along the barren landscape, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement, a faint sound reached his ears. It was almost imperceptible, a weak, pitiful cry. Bonner paused, his military instincts kicking in. He quickly activated his cloaking device, making sure he remained unseen by the enemy. The cry came again, more desperate this time. He couldn't ignore it. Despite the potential danger, he knew he had to investigate. Moving carefully, Bonner followed the sound, his footsteps muffled by the thick snow underfoot. He kept his weapon at the ready, just in case. The cry led him to a large, jagged rock formation, its dark shadows providing a welcome contrast to the blinding white of the surrounding desert. As he approached the rock's base, something glimmered faintly in the dim light. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped closer, and what he saw made him freeze. There, discarded like refuse, lay the limp body of an alien woman. She was barely breathing, her once vibrant skin now gray and bruised. Her body was battered, as though she had been thrown aside after being used for some cruel purpose. Her hair, once a striking color, was matted with dirt and blood. Bonner's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside her, quickly checking for a pulse. To his relief, he felt a faint thrum of life beneath her cold skin. "What happened to you?" Bonner muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with both anger and sorrow. He had seen countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for this. The woman's ragged breaths were the only sound in the otherwise still air. Bonner's hands trembled as he carefully lifted her into his arms, cradling her gently against his chest. "Hang in there," he whispered, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. He had no idea who she was or why she had been left here to die. But he couldn't just leave her. She wasn't some expendable asset. She was a living being, and she deserved better than to be cast aside like trash. Bonner knew he had to get her to shelter, away from the cold that threatened to take her life. He made his way back to the caves he had passed earlier, hoping they would provide some form of protection from the harsh elements. The alien woman's head lolled against his shoulder, her breath shallow, her body limp. Bonner's mind raced as he carried her through the icy terrain. He had no medical supplies with him, nothing but his wits and sheer determination. By the time they reached the caves, Bonner was out of breath, but he didn't stop. He carefully set her down on the cold stone floor, looking around to make sure there were no immediate threats. The cave seemed to offer some protection from the wind, but the temperature was still dangerously low. He needed to act fast. Bonner used the small amount of tech he had on him, a portable med kit and a thermal blanket, to stabilize the alien woman. He applied a serum he'd learned to make in training, hoping it would help her body start to heal. The freezing cold had already caused extensive damage, and he could only hope that it wasn't too late. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't a random encounter. There was too much cruelty in the way she had been discarded. Bonner's mind flashed back to the reports of human slaves being trafficked across the galaxy, sold into servitude by powerful factions. Had she been one of them? Was she a victim of the same ruthless forces that had enslaved so many? Bonner clenched his jaw, fury burning in his veins. And what happens to her? What happens to the people who don't fit into your new world? Drake's smile grew wider, almost cruel. "That's not my problem anymore." With a swift motion, Bonner raised his weapon, aiming directly at Drake. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Betrayal had a price, and Drake would pay it. But before Bonner could pull the trigger, a loud crack split the air, and the ground beneath them shook. A sudden explosion sent them all to the ground, throwing Bonner and Lyra into the dirt. their ears ringing from the blast. Bonner struggled to his feet, his head spinning. His heart raced as he turned to Lyra, but what he saw in her eyes made his blood run cold. The trust he had fought so hard to build was shattered. The truth had been exposed in a way neither of them were ready for. The enemy wasn't just out there. They were already here. The explosion had rattled Bonner to his core, but it had also reignited something within him, something raw and fierce. As he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the sound of soldiers shouting, orders being barked in a language he didn't understand. But one thing was clear: the final battle was upon them. The enemy was closing in, and there was no more running. Bonner turned to Lyra, who was on the ground beside him, dazed but still alive. She blinked, shaking her head as if trying to clear the fog in her mind from the explosion. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. There was no turning back now. The fight they had been running from had finally caught up with them. The only way out was through. "We have to move," Bonner said urgently, pulling Lyra to her feet. His hand gripped hers tightly, not out of fear, but to give her strength. She nodded, her face set in determination, and together they moved towards the thick cover of the forest. The air was thick with tension, the silence of the night shattered by distant gunfire, and the whir of enemy drones scanning the area. Bonner could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. They had no allies left, no backup, just the two of them against a powerful, ruthless enemy. And yet, as impossible as it seemed, Bonner knew they had one thing the enemy didn't: hope. Lyra had been through hell, but she was still standing, and that was a strength Bonner couldn't underestimate. She had been discarded, treated like nothing more than a piece of expendable equipment, and yet here she was, ready to fight for her life. And for the first time since the war had begun, Bonner wasn't fighting for orders, for a cause, or even for survival. He was fighting for her. Bonner's mind raced as he scanned the area. He could see flashes of movement ahead, soldiers closing in from all sides. They had to act quickly, or they would be surrounded. There was only one option left. "I'm going to draw them out," Bonner said, his voice firm but calm. "You stay low, keep your head down. I'll signal you when it's time to move." Lyra hesitated, her brow furrowing as she looked at him. "You're going to fight them alone." Bonner met her gaze, a reassuring look in his eyes. "I'm not alone. I've got you." Lyra nodded, the trust between them clear. She understood. They both understood. There would be no easy way out, but there was no turning back either. Bonner activated his cloaking device and melted into the shadows, moving quickly and silently through the trees. He was a soldier, trained for situations like this. He had fought countless battles, faced impossible odds, but this felt different. This wasn't just about survival, it was about revenge. He reached the ridge overlooking the enemy camp. The soldiers were scattered, not expecting an attack from this direction. It was the perfect opportunity to strike. He pulled out his rifle, taking careful aim at the nearest soldier. With a sharp, controlled breath, he fired. The shot echoed through the night. A clean hit. The soldier crumpled to the ground without a sound. Bonner moved quickly, using the chaos he had just created to his advantage. He slipped through the trees, firing on the enemy as he went, picking them off one by one. The soldiers were scrambling now, shouting in confusion, trying to locate the source of the attack. Bonner didn't give them a chance. He moved like a shadow, swift and deadly, his training kicking in with every shot. But as he made his way deeper into the camp, he saw something that stopped him cold. Lyra. She had ignored his order to stay hidden. She was running through the open, charging straight into the heart of the enemy camp, a weapon in her hand. The alien woman nodded, her face pale with fear, but she didn't argue. They started moving again, Bonner leading the way, constantly checking their surroundings for any signs of the enemy. The landscape was vast and empty, offering little cover, but Bonner knew that they had to keep going. Hours passed as they moved across the barren planet, the cold seeping into Bonner's bones. He could feel the exhaustion settling in, but he pushed it aside. They had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small hidden shelter, a cave system that Bonner had mapped out during a previous mission. It wasn't much, but it was safe for the moment. Bonner led the alien woman inside, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. They had made it through the worst part, but the journey was far from over. Bonner didn't know what awaited them, but he knew that he couldn't let anything happen to her. Not after everything she had been through. As he set up a temporary camp, Bonner looked at the alien woman, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He was going to protect her, no matter what it took. Bonner sat by the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the walls of their makeshift shelter. His eyes were fixed on the alien woman, still lying on the cold ground, wrapped in a thermal blanket to help her recover from the trauma. He had done everything he could to stabilize her, but the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. She was still weak, and they both knew that time was running out. The moment they had arrived at the shelter, Bonner had gone into survival mode. He set up basic defenses, checking his weapons and preparing for whatever might come their way. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. Not after what had almost happened with the drones. The alien woman stirred, her eyes flickering open. Bonner immediately got to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but he relaxed when he saw that she was just trying to sit up. She looked at him with a mix of confusion and gratitude in her eyes. Her condition had improved slightly since they had reached the shelter, but she was still fragile, and Bonner knew she wasn't out of danger yet. "You okay?" Bonner asked, his voice softer than usual. She nodded, though it was clear that she was still struggling to fully understand what had happened to her. She reached for the blanket, trying to pull it tighter around herself as she sat up, wincing slightly. Bonner could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thank you for saving me." Bonner didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure what had driven him to help her, whether it was the fact that he couldn't stand to see someone suffer, or if it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Either way, it didn't matter now. What mattered was that they were alive, and they had a chance to fight back. "We need to keep moving," Bonner said. "The enemy is still out there, and we can't let them find us." The alien woman nodded, though she looked uncertain. She had no weapons, no training. She was a prisoner, a slave, and the thought of her fighting back seemed impossible. But Bonner knew better than to underestimate anyone, especially after everything he had seen. He wasn't going to leave her to fend for herself, but he wasn't going to let her sit this out either. "You're not alone in this," Bonner added, his voice steady. "I'll make sure we both get out of here. But you need to trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, as if considering his words. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded again, her expression hardening. "I trust you." Bonner gave her a reassuring smile, though the uncertainty in his own heart still lingered. He didn't know what they were up against, but he knew they couldn't keep running forever. The enemy wouldn't give up so easily. They spent the next few hours preparing for what was to come. Bonner taught her the basics of survival, how to handle a weapon, how to move quietly, and how to use the environment to their advantage. The alien woman wasn't as quick to pick up the skills as Bonner had hoped, but she was determined. She had to be. If they were going to survive, they both needed to fight. "They don't get to define you," Bonner said, his voice firm. "You are more than what they made you." Lyra looked up at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I hope you're right. But what if they come after me again? What if they come after you?" Bonner didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing. He knew the enemy would be relentless. He had seen their kind before, their cold, calculating precision. They weren't the kind of force that gave up easily, and Bonner's worst fear was that they had only scratched the surface of something much darker. "I'll protect you," Bonner finally said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." But as he spoke the words, something in the back of his mind nagged at him, a creeping doubt that he couldn't shake. The more he thought about it, the more it didn't add up. He had been part of this war long enough to know when something was off, when a mission felt too easy. And their escape so far, the way they had evaded capture, something didn't sit right. Bonner stood up abruptly, his hand going to his sidearm instinctively. "We need to move. Now." Lyra blinked in confusion, but stood up quickly, following his lead. "What's wrong?" Bonner's eyes scanned their surroundings. Everything looked calm, peaceful even, but his instincts were screaming. Something was about to happen, something they hadn't anticipated. Without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. A soft, rhythmic march, too coordinated to be a random patrol. Bonner's heart sank as he realized what was happening. They had been followed. And worse, they had been betrayed. "I knew it," Bonner muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. Before Lyra could ask what he meant, a voice came from behind them. "You didn't think we'd just let you get away, did you?" Bonner whipped around, his hand instinctively going for his weapon, but his heart dropped when he saw the figure stepping out from the shadows. It was Sergeant Drake, his old squad mate, the man who had been like a brother to him. But the look on Drake's face, cold, detached, told Bonner everything he needed to know. Drake wasn't the man Bonner had once trusted, not anymore. "What's this?" Bonner demanded, keeping his weapon trained on Drake. "You sold us out." Drake's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Not sold out, Bonner. Just doing what's necessary. The mission is bigger than you." "Bigger than her," he said, nodding toward Lyra, who stood frozen, confusion and fear written all over her face. "You're working with them." Bonner's voice was a low growl, disbelief flooding him. His mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. The betrayal was too much to comprehend, but the signs were all there. They had been too safe for too long. They had been led into a trap. Drake's expression remained unchanged. "I never wanted to be part of this war. I wanted out. But when the offer came from them, well, I couldn't resist. I'll get a promotion, maybe even a place in the new regime. It's a better deal than being stuck in the trenches, don't you think?" Bonner's mind spun with the weight of the revelation. His old friend, his brother, was now the enemy. He had been lured by the promise of power, willing to sacrifice everything for a seat at the table. Bonner felt sick to his stomach, as if the world had suddenly twisted into something unrecognizable. The man who had fought beside him, bled beside him, was now the very thing they had been fighting against. Lyra, still standing by Bonner's side, looked between the two men, her expression filled with confusion. "Why? Why would you betray us? We never did anything to you." Drake sneered, his gaze cold and distant. "You didn't need to do anything. It's not personal. It's just business." He paused, eyeing Bonner with a hint of regret. "You should have known. You should have figured it out sooner. The war was never going to end in our favor. The best we can do is survive. And for that, you need to make alliances." The words hit Bonner like a punch to the gut. He had been too blind, too focused on survival to see the bigger picture. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They were no longer just fighting the enemy. They were fighting those who had once been their own. "You made a deal with them," Bonner spat, anger rising in his chest. "And now you're going to throw it all away for some corporate deal. For what? A few extra credits." Drake's eyes flashed with irritation. "It's not just credits, Bonner. It's control, power, the future. You think they're going to stop at just you and her? No. They want to control everything. They want to win this war, and they need people like me to help them do it." Bonner's heart stopped for a moment, fear gripping him. He had told her to stay down, to stay safe, but there she was, fighting her own battle. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. He wasn't just going to protect her anymore. She was no longer the scared alien woman he had saved. She was his equal. She was a fighter. Lyra, Bonner shouted, but it was too late. She had already engaged the enemy, taking down 2 soldiers with precision and speed that stunned him. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for her. Bonner dove into the fray, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was chaotic now, every soldier for themselves. There were no more tactics, no more strategy, just survival. Bonner fired, reloading, firing again. The sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the night as the battlefield turned into a deadly dance of survival. But as the fight raged on, Bonner felt the shift. He wasn't just fighting to escape anymore. He was fighting to win. He was fighting for a future, for a world where Lyra could be free, where they could both walk away from this war and live without fear. He found her again, her back to him as she took down another soldier. She turned to him, a fierce look in her eyes. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "We finish this together." Bonner nodded. They were in this together. He could see it in her eyes. She had become the warrior he knew she could be. Together, they were unstoppable. The final wave of soldiers charged toward them, a relentless tide of death and destruction. Bonner's rifle was running low on ammo, but he didn't stop. He grabbed a fallen soldier's weapon, reloading it as quickly as he could. Lyra was by his side, her own weapon raised, ready to fight to the bitter end. They fought back, taking down soldier after soldier, pushing them back with everything they had. The enemy was strong, but they were no match for the combined force of Bonner and Lyra. They'd moved as one, their bodies working in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's moves, covering each other's blind spots. Finally, after what felt like hours, the enemy retreated. The battlefield fell silent, save for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant crackling of fire. Bonner stood, his body covered in dirt and blood, his mind racing. It was over. For now. He turned to Lyra, his heart still racing. She was panting, covered in sweat and dirt, but there was a look of triumph on her face. She had fought beside him, and they had won. "We did it," Lyra said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and disbelief. Bonner smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "We did it." For the first time in a long while, Bonner allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future after all. The war was far from over, but they had won this battle. Together. As the smoke cleared and the stars above them began to shine through the smoke, Bonner took Lyra's hand in his. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The aftermath of the battle left Bonner and Lyra standing in the remains of the enemy camp, the echoes of gunfire slowly fading into silence. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the bitter tang of metal. Fires burned in the distance, sending dark plumes of smoke spiraling into the sky. The chaos of the night was now replaced with an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch for miles. Bonner wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, his hand trembling from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He turned to Lyra, who was standing beside him, just as exhausted but resolute. She was covered in dirt, her clothes torn from the battle, but there was a fire in her eyes, a sense of victory that couldn't be extinguished. They had made it through the storm, and despite everything, they were still alive. The weight of what they had just done, what they had overcome, was starting to sink in. The enemy, the betrayal, the fight, it was all over. But the cost had been high. So many lives had been lost, including the lives of those Bonner had once considered family. Bonner didn't know where to start. There was so much to process. The war, the betrayal by Drake, the final battle, the rush of emotions that had come with each moment. They were all jumbled in his mind, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to let it end here. Not like this. "Are you okay?" Bonner asked, his voice soft as he looked at Lyra, concern etched on his face. She had been through so much already, and he knew this battle had taken a toll on her. But she only gave him a small, tired smile, shaking her head. I'm not sure, she said quietly, her voice distant. But I will be. We made it, didn't we? You're safe. For now, Bonner replied, trying to reassure her, though he knew their safety was temporary at best. She didn't respond, just gazed at him, as if trying to understand him. Bonner wasn't sure how much she remembered, or if she even knew who she was. Her eyes told him she was scared, scared of what had happened to her, and scared of what was going to happen next. We need to get out of here, Bonner said. Can you stand? She nodded slightly, though it was clear she was still weak. Bonner helped her to her feet, his arm steady around her waist to keep her from falling. She looked up at him with uncertain eyes. What's your name? Bonner asked, realizing that he had never asked her. I don't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was just a number. Bonner felt a pang of sadness for her. She had been reduced to nothing more than an object, a tool for someone else's purpose. He wanted to help her, to give her back her identity. But for now he couldn't. He had no time to ask questions. They had to get moving. The cave was a temporary refuge, but it wasn't safe. Bonner knew that the enemy was out there, searching for them. He couldn't stay here for long. He'd have to rely on his training and the few tools he had to get them out of this mess. He pulled out a small portable cloaking device from his pack. It was a basic model, but it would do the job for a short while. Bonner activated it, and the cave entrance shimmered for a moment before blending back into the rocky surroundings. We'll use this to stay hidden, Bonner said. It's not perfect, but it'll buy us some time. The alien woman nodded, though she still looked uncertain. Bonner gave her a reassuring smile, but it didn't feel genuine. He didn't know if they would make it out of this alive, but he had to try. They moved quickly, Bonner leading the way. The wind whipped around them as they navigated through the cold, barren landscape. The cloaking device kept them hidden, but Bonner could still feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. They were out in the open, with no way of knowing if the enemy had already picked up their trail. Every sound, every rustle in the wind, made Bonner's heart race. He kept a tight grip on his weapon, constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. But as the minutes passed, the tension only seemed to grow. The air was thick with it, and Bonner's nerves were on edge. Suddenly, a sound pierced the air, a distant mechanical hum. Bonner froze, his eyes narrowing. He didn't need to look to know what it was. He had heard that sound before. It was the sound of enemy drones. He grabbed the alien woman's arm, pulling her closer to him. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. They crouched low behind a large rock formation, hoping the drones wouldn't detect them. Bonner's heart was pounding in his chest as he watched the sky. The drones were getting closer, their mechanical whirring growing louder. The cloaking device wasn't perfect, and if they were spotted, they wouldn't have a chance. Bonner's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. The drones came into view, their sleek metal bodies glinting in the pale light. Bonner's breath caught in his throat as they passed by, just a few yards from their hiding place. He held his breath, praying that they wouldn't notice him, that they wouldn't see them. The drones moved on, their attention elsewhere, and Bonner exhaled a sigh of relief. But the danger wasn't over. The fact that they had come so close to being caught meant that they were running out of time. "We need to move," Bonner said urgently. "We're too exposed here." By the time they were ready, Bonner had a plan. The nearest enemy base was several miles away, and though it was heavily guarded, it was their only option. He didn't have enough firepower to take on the entire base, but he wasn't planning to. His goal was to create enough of a distraction for them to slip through unnoticed. It was risky, but it was the only plan they had. "We're going to hit them hard and fast," Bonner explained, his tone serious. "I'll make the first move, draw their attention. You take cover, stay out of sight. Once they're distracted, we make our way to the eastern exit. We'll meet there." The alien woman looked uneasy, but she didn't argue. She had no choice but to trust him. Bonner could see the fear in her eyes, But there was something else there too, a spark of determination. She had been through so much already, and this was her chance to fight back, to take control of her fate. Bonner gave her one last look, then nodded. "Stay safe. I'll see you on the other side." They moved out, their steps quick but quiet as they made their way toward the enemy base. Bonner kept his cloaking device activated, staying hidden as he scouted the area. The closer they got, the more tense the air became. Bonner could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. They had to make this work. There was no turning back now. When they reached the perimeter of the enemy base, Bonner gave the alien woman a final glance. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll give you the signal when it's time to move." The alien woman nodded, her grip tightening around the weapon Bonner had given her. He could see her hands trembling. But she didn't let it stop her. She was ready, or at least as ready as she could be. Bonner moved forward, cloaked in the shadows, keeping an eye on the guards patrolling the perimeter. He waited for the perfect moment, then launched his attack. The explosion was small but enough to catch the guards off guard. As the noise rang through the air, Bonner sprang into action, using the confusion to slip past the guards and head toward the eastern exit. The alien woman followed his instructions, staying hidden as the chaos unfolded. She watched as Bonner fought off the guards, his movements quick and precise. It was like watching a well-oiled machine in action. She had never seen anything like it. His skill, his determination, his will to protect. But the enemy wasn't stupid. They quickly regrouped, sending more reinforcements to the base's perimeter. Bonner was fighting on multiple fronts now, outnumbered and outgunned, but he didn't back down. His instincts kicked in, and he knew what he had to do. Meanwhile, the alien woman moved through the shadows, doing her best to stay out of sight. She had never fought like this before, but she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. For the first time, she felt like she was in control. She wasn't a victim anymore. She spotted Bonner, and though he was surrounded by enemies, there was a moment, a fleeting moment, where their eyes met. Without a second thought, she raised her weapon and fired, taking down one of the soldiers who was closing in on him. Bonner gave her a nod of approval, and in that instant, they knew they were in this together. They had each other's backs, and together, they would fight until the end. The night was quiet, too quiet for Bonner's liking. The small, makeshift camp they had set up deep in the forest offered some temporary relief from the chaos, but it was only a matter of time before the enemy tracked them down again. The cloaking devices they had used earlier were working for now, but Bonner knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The alien woman, whose name Bonner had learned to be Lyra, sat beside the fire, her eyes distant. It was as if she was reliving everything she had endured, trying to make sense of the pain. Bonner could see it in her eyes, the fear, the confusion, the lingering doubt. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to understand who she was, who she could be, after everything that had been done to her. "I never thought I would see a world like this," Lyra murmured, staring into the flames. "I was nothing, just a tool. They used me, and then they cast me aside like I meant nothing. I'm not sure I'll ever understand what it means to be free." Bonner sat down across from her, his own thoughts heavy. He could relate, in some ways. He had seen too many soldiers discarded by the system, too many lives lost for a cause they never believed in. He had been trained to fight, to follow orders without question, but every day he found himself questioning his purpose more and more. He knelt beside her as the serum took effect. Her breathing became a bit steadier, but her eyes remained closed. It was only then that Bonner allowed himself a moment to breathe, his own exhaustion catching up with him. He hadn't realized how much the tension of the past few hours had worn him down. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know why he felt so deeply for this stranger, this woman from an entirely different world, but something inside him pushed him to care, to save her. The woman stirred slightly, a soft groan escaping her lips. Bonner's eyes widened in relief. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, revealing a soft glow of blue, the color a stark contrast to the cold surroundings. Her gaze flickered around, disoriented, before focusing on Bonner's face. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither saying anything. She seemed to be taking in her surroundings, unsure of where she was or what had happened. Bonner's heart skipped a beat when she tried to speak. Her voice was weak, barely a rasp. "W where?" She trailed off, clearly struggling to form a coherent thought. Her hand weakly reached up to touch her neck, as though she was trying to recall something important, but she faltered. Bonner leaned in slightly, his tone soft. "You're safe. For now." Her eyes searched his face as if trying to read him. Her brow furrowed. And for a moment, she looked almost lost. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did you help me?" Bonner felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't sure how to answer that. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand to see someone suffer like that. Maybe it was because he saw a part of himself in her, someone who had been thrown aside, discarded by a system that didn't care. "Because," Bonner said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his heart, "no one deserves to be thrown away like that. You don't deserve to die alone." The alien woman seemed to relax slightly, though she was still weak. Her eyes closed again, as if the effort of speaking had drained her. Bonner watched her closely, knowing the hard part was just beginning. But he was determined to see this through. Whatever her past was, whatever danger they might face, he wasn't going to let her go through it alone. In that moment, Bonner made a promise to himself. He would protect her, no matter the cost. The cold was unbearable. The wind howled through the jagged rocks, and Bonner could feel it biting through his suit, reminding him of the hostile planet they were on. But it wasn't the cold that weighed on him now. It was the alien woman, lying unconscious in the cave, her body still fragile from the injuries she had endured. Bonner had spent the last few hours trying to stabilize her, using the little medical equipment he had. The serum he had injected into her was taking effect, and her breathing had become steadier. Her body was still weak, but at least she wasn't slipping away anymore. He sat by her side, watching her closely, his mind racing. He had no idea who she was or where she came from, but the way she had been discarded like waste, it made his blood boil. She had been thrown away by someone, by something. There was a cruelty in the way she was treated, and Bonner knew it was no accident. There was a larger story here, one that had yet to unfold. But for now, he couldn't think about that. His only focus was getting her out of here alive. The planet was dangerous, filled with harsh elements and hostile forces. Bonner knew that the longer they stayed, the higher the chance they would be discovered. The enemy had been tracking his every move, and though they hadn't found him yet, it was only a matter of time. He couldn't risk it. He had to move fast. Bonner gently shook her awake, calling her name softly. Her eyes fluttered open, still hazy from the drugs and trauma. She blinked, confusion clouding her face as she tried to make sense of where she was. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse and barely audible. Bonner nodded, his eyes scanning the wreckage around them. The sound of distant sirens and the hum of drones still filled the air, but there was something different now. Something changed. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had won a victory. A small one, perhaps, but one that meant the world to them. "We did," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the world on his shoulders. "We survived." There was a long pause, the only sound the crackling of fire in the distance. Bonner felt a surge of emotion as he looked at Lyra. She had been his strength, his reason to keep going through everything. Without her, he didn't know if he would have made it this far. She had taught him something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. That hope could still exist, even in the darkest times. They had both been broken in different ways, but together, they had found something worth fighting for. But as he thought about the battle, the loss of comrades, the betrayal, Bonner's heart grew heavy. He couldn't just walk away from it all. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many things left to set right. And Lyra needed more than just survival. She needed to be free, truly free, of the shadow of the war, of the people who had treated her like an object. He couldn't let her go back to that life. She deserved so much more. "We can't stop here," Bonner said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "The war isn't over, and there are still people out there who need our help." Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with something new. Resolve, strength. It was the same fire he had seen in her when she had picked up a weapon and fought beside him. The fire that had burned through the darkness of their journey together. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady, as if she had already made up her mind. Bonner looked at her, taking a deep breath. "We keep fighting. We find a way to end this. Together." There was no fear in her eyes, just determination. She had been enslaved, used, and thrown away. But now she was standing beside him, an equal, a partner in this fight. She was no longer the helpless victim. She was a warrior. And that was the person Bonner was fighting for now. Lyra, the woman who had survived against all odds and was ready to take the future into her own hands. The two of them stood there in the silence, surrounded by the devastation of the battle. But in that moment, there was hope. For the first time in a long while, Bonner allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this war. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, more pain. But together, they were stronger than they had ever been apart. As the dawn began to break, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Bonner and Lyra knew their journey was far from over. They had made it through the worst of it, but there was still a long road ahead. But they would walk it together, one step at a time. Bonner glanced at Lyra, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You know," he said softly, "this isn't the ending I imagined. But it's a new beginning, a new chapter." Lyra smiled back, a glimmer of hope shining in her eyes. "It's not the ending I imagined either, but I think it's the one we needed." And in that moment, Bonner realized that everything they had fought for, everything they had lost, had led them to this point. They were more than survivors now. They were warriors. And together, they were unstoppable. The future was uncertain, the war far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they had a chance. And with that, they turned and walked away from the battlefield, ready to face whatever came next. They had survived the worst. Now, they would build something better, something worth fighting for.